Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. In this special edition, we're focusing on the plight of women in Afghanistan 6 months after the Taliban retook the country. Who can forget those horrific images of thousands of people desperately seeking to flee its capital, Kabul? Many of them were women who knew that life under the Taliban would become exceedingly repressive, and their fears have been realised. For those women and girls left behind, many have found their lives shrunk to the four walls of their homes, either due to losing their jobs or being unable to continue their education. Yet, as the Taliban desperately seeks international recognition for its financially strapped government, it's embarked on a violent crackdown on dissent. In recent weeks, some women's rights activists have now gone missing. The United Nations and human rights groups are demanding now to know their whereabouts. James Mulholland and Emerald Maxwell report.
These Afghan women hide their faces for security reasons. They are fighters. Hidden in this flat in Kabul, they're preparing their next action against the Taliban. Of all ages and from all backgrounds, they've come together to stand up for their rights, which have been violated since the fundamentalists returned to power last August. Very few women agree to speak openly. We've masked the identity of this poet and activist for her safety.
The fear of these women is that they will be killed before they carry out their objective, or that their families and children will be injured. When the demonstration is over, we change in a restaurant, in a shop, or in a place where there is a crowd of people, so as not to be recognised.
Revealing too much of their identities carries a real risk for these women. Fresh in all of their minds is the recent disappearance of at least 4 of their fellow activists. The Taliban deny any involvement in the cases.
I worry about what type of violence they might be experiencing. The Taliban's denials are not very credible because they've been so untruthful so often about so many things.
The UN has urged the authorities to investigate the disappearances. Many activists have since gone into hiding, reporting continued threats.
Joining me now is Shaharzad Akbar, the former chairperson for the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, who's been living in exile in Istanbul since last August. Thank you so much for your time. What is the situation on the ground like now for women in Afghanistan?
Thank you for having me. The situation on the ground for women in Afghanistan is dire. The country was already a very difficult country for women prior to Taliban's takeover. Now women's access to their basic fundamental human rights are banned, so girls in many provinces can't go to secondary school. Women in many sectors, except health and education, have been told to stay home, so female professionals have to stay home with no certainty about the future. Additionally, there has been a round of crackdown and pressure on protesters, and women were the ones who were protesting for their human rights mainly. So we have had several cases of abductions of female protesters with no news of their safety, even proof of life. And this has created a widespread environment of fear for women who want to have a public life or be civil society activists or raise their voice in any way.
And we've just seen that report of very brave women standing up to the Taliban. We're also hearing about secret schools being set up for girls. But to what extent is there a resistance?
The only resistance in Afghanistan right now against the Taliban rule is really the women's resistance, I would say. We saw the women's rights movement in Afghanistan. We saw them being pretty outspoken during the so-called peace process between Taliban and the US. Speaking about an inclusive process. They were, in fact, the only cohesive constituency with clear demands. And now also, since Taliban take over, it's, initially it was almost daily news of women coming to the streets, protesting, women setting up secret schools, women trying to, 2 sisters singing in their homes under the burqa and putting up the video clips on the internet just to send a message about that the Afghan women will continue to engage in art and culture. All forms of creative ways, women writing graffiti on the walls about human rights of women, and also Afghan women in exile having a very cohesive voice about how the international community should and should not engage with the Taliban. So I would say that the most inspiring aspect of the resistance for me is the fact that it's the Afghan women who have not given up on their human rights and the human rights of all Afghans.
And what would you say to those who argue that the Taliban's approach to women's rights merely reflects societal attitudes and the belief that feminism is a Western concept?
Afghans may have difference of opinion on women's employment, to what extent it's acceptable to families in rural areas, but women's right to education is, I would say, a universal demand of Afghan people, and this is being repressed by the Taliban. So no, the Taliban do not represent the views of majority of Afghans when it comes to, for instance, freedom of expression and ability of people, the right of people to criticize their rulers, women's access to education, freedom of movement for women. And some issues, of course, they might represent views of the more conservative elements within the society, but the way they are using brutality to impose their views that go in contradiction with the views of the majority, that's where the fear is coming from. And that's why you're seeing Afghans either leaving the country every day or trying to leave.
Shaharzad, we're just going to pause there because even before the Taliban seized power last August, the UN had reported that 87% of Afghan women had experienced some form of violence. In the last 6 months, the situation has dramatically deteriorated, with shelters closing and thus forcing women to live with their abusers. Shirley Sitbon has more.
Fatima was 7 when she was forced to marry an 80-year-old man. When he died, she was forced into a second marriage with a violent man who raped and beat her. She saw only one way out.
I tried to kill myself. I drank sulfuric acid. I was hospitalized for a month and a half. The doctors said I needed a follow-up operation, but my mother-in-law refused to let me return to the hospital.
Fatima managed to escape and live in hiding in a shelter. But she can lose her spot at any time, a terrifying prospect. The Taliban have shut down almost all of Afghanistan's women's shelters. In this case, though, they've harassed the activists who are running it.
Everything is over for women. Who will help them now? Even I am being threatened, so how can I help others? It's impossible.
Yet the Taliban promised they had changed when they retook power. In November, their spokesperson said authorities would allow battered women to sue their attackers. Zakia doesn't believe them. She has lived in a shelter since she escaped her violent husband.
I arrived here with many dreams, hoping to get a divorce and restart my life, find work. But when the Taliban took over the country, all my dreams were shattered. Divorcing is impossible since the judges and lawyers have left the country.
According to the UN, 87% of Afghan women have faced physical, sexual, or psychological violence. That extraordinary figure dating back to before the situation worsened with the Taliban return to power.
The gender violence is still going on in the houses, in the families, in the villages. But the only thing that has changed from then is that those women, they know that the second they leave their houses, if they do, they are going to be taken, and sent in prison. And that will be the end of it.
In recent months, the limited progress that had been made in women's rights has been completely rolled back. The Women's Affairs Ministry having been replaced by the Ministry of Vice and Virtue.
And with me, Shaharzad Akbar, former chairperson for the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, who's been living in exile in Istanbul since last August. We've just seen a very grim report there on the situation for domestic violence victims living in the country becoming now intolerable since the Taliban seized power. But with the country experiencing severe famine, and given what we're seeing is happening to women in Afghanistan, what conditions should the international community attach to any form of aid?
Well, humanitarian aid has to be unconditional, of course, but It's the oversight of the humanitarian aid that remains very important to make sure that humanitarian aid is also reaching women and that it's reaching all communities without discrimination, and Taliban are not interfering in distribution of aid. Additionally, any form of assistance to education sector or to health sector, which I think should happen in terms of salaries for teachers and healthcare workers, they can be, some conditions can be attached to them. For instance, they should start paying, the international community should start paying salaries of teachers in provinces where girls are going to school throughout the high school. Healthcare facilities should be accessible to women who are not accompanied by a male family member, because this restriction of having a male family member accompany you is barring access for millions of Afghan women who are widows or for other reasons cannot have adult male members of their families accompany them to access basic health services. Additionally, women's rights and human rights should be at the center of any discussion about further assistance to Taliban. They can't get away with continuously abducting women protesters, with enforced disappearances, with targeted killings, with a full-on gender apartheid, and continue to receive international assistance.
Shaharzad Akbar, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for now. We're going to leave you with images of life for Afghan women and girls living in exile since August 2021. So until our next show, bye for now.